If you're looking for a high DPS, high movement speed build that doesn't die often, then this might be the build for you. Welcome to my video guide for Self-Chill Explosive Trap Trickster, a build that starts its in-game skill at level 2, scales smoothly into mapping, and can start doing in-game boss content for minimal investment. Not only that, the build's ceiling is astronomical, with damage in the many hundreds of millions. This guide will walk you through leveling an axe, gear progression, and transitioning to self-chill in the endgame. First off, some things to know about this build. It's not the most complex build, but there are more things to keep track of than, say, a Toxic Rain build. For one, self-chill as a mechanic requires balancing chaos resistance, life regeneration, and a handful of very specific pieces of gear, which I'll go over towards the end of the video. And secondly, this build is a trapper. Playstyle isn't for everyone, but I can assure you that self-chill traps is one of the most enjoyable, if not the most enjoyable, of all the trappers to play. High movement speed and a massive action speed boost that self-chill provides to trap throwing speed makes a build feel very good to play. It's not a one-trick speed bossing pony either. You can tackle all content with it. Last league I did my Sim 30 with this build. You can play most mechanics very efficiently, as it's one of the better expedition, essence, harvest farmers. I did a series of videos on scaling this way into endgame, but this one's going to be focused on League Start. So the League Start PoB goes all the way up to around a 70C or 80C build on League Start. It involves getting gear that looks like this. So I have a vendor recipe scepter in both hands, a very simple hubris circlet. Most of this gear is just, it's a 5-link explosive trap. Some really basic rings. All you need to do is cap res, look for life, look for energy shield. I am using a boot enchant here, but no helmet, and a Sunblast. This is an Elder glove, but that happens to be just all I had in my inventory. And a Sunblast. This is the only unique the build uses, and the tree is super simple. This is the only thing we're actually using is a medium cluster, and the rest of it is just from the tree. Now, I've updated this to use the 321 tree in PoB, which just came out a few hours ago, but this is a pretty close approximation. Okay, let's get into the PoB. This is the early mapping setup. I put several trees in here all the way through Axe and into early maps. Early maps is a crit-based explosive trapper. It uses a Sunblast, however this is not self-chill. There's another PoB that is self-chill based. Even without self-chill, we're still doing a respectable amount of damage on basically trash gear. So all of this is a vendor recipe scepter, alternating scepter to give us Secrets of Suffering, a vendor recipe void scepter to give us, both of these give us +1 level to fizz spell gems, and then the rest of this is mostly trash. It's just life, ES, res. There is a +1 on the amulet, and I think this is actually going to be maybe the most expensive part of the build, and the primary expense is going to be sovereignties. Everything else is super straightforward. Some simple rare jewels, 2 modules, and skills that are just your basic skills. These are skill level 19, gem level 19 across the board, and we're still doing very respectable damage even on a 5-link. Real quick, I want to call something out. You'll notice in the early maps that there is a fire trap setup, and this is amazing for clear all the way through campaign and into early maps. However, the moment you are able to purchase and equip an alternating scepter, you need to get rid of it. And the reason is this is primarily doing damage through Ignite, and Secrets of Suffering prevents you from igniting. It turns Ignite into Scorch, which again is a nice fat DPS boost, but the utility of Valley Prolif and Combustion is centered around Ignite, which you can no longer do. This PoB at maps is set up to be level 85. However, I have included skill trees for Act 1 through 10 all the way into early maps. Acts 1 through 10 is not going to be crit based, it's just going to be flat elemental damage based. And also you'll see skill sets for Act 1, 2, 3, and then the rest of Acts is all going to be this. Basically, to start, you're going to either grab a green, green, blue or green, green, green. Either works fine, but the important part is that you go and get this link set up before Brutus, so level 8. In 321, they've nerfed leveling a bit. They've removed the vendor wand, which made Brutus pretty trivial but now it's going to be important that you grab enough damage to burst him down. Bear Trap is amazing. You're going to want Bear Trap pretty much the entire time. Frostblink, if you can, also Frostblink through Brutus, also helpful. In Act 2, you're going to pick up a clear skill in Fire Trap. You get this the moment you get into Act 2. Blue, green, Fire Trap, Combustion, Ellie Prolif is going to be fantastic for clear all the way through the campaign and into early maps until you transition into an alternating scepter. Hat tip to one of my subscribers mentioned this, and this is actually really nice. I tried it out. And part of the reason why this guide took a little longer is I kept playtesting this to make sure it felt good, even without Arcane Surge and Vendor Wands. But yeah, this feels pretty good. I'll also say that in Act 3, you're going to want to pick up Leap Slam. I left some notes in the PoB here for offhand leveling gems, which is going to be important. And mentioning this, I want to say this out loud in the video, but now that the vendor recipe is gone, it's totally worthwhile to pick up and ID all magic and rare scepters. Any caster base is fine, but flat damage added to spells is a major comfort during the campaign. It makes the campaign feel super trivial. Do yourself a favor, roughly 22% of the mod pool in low-level caster-based weapons, so Wand, Scepter, Rune Dagger, are flat damage to spells. One thing that's important to cover is how does the build feel to play. So normally trappers, you would throw a trap and it would sit on the ground for up to 2 seconds and then go off by itself. Or if an enemy or a mob ran across it, it would trigger the trap. We're using Sunblast to roughly triple our damage, but one of the important lines on it is that it cannot be triggered by enemies. So what this means is, even if an enemy runs over this, it's not going to go off. Instead, it reduces the trap duration by between 50 and 75%, and then it just goes off automatically. This is important because it makes the build feel different to play. Like normally, a trapper, you would want to throw things at mobs, and instead, playing with a Sunblast is more like laying down an AoE, and I'll try to show what that means. So you're kind of just painting the ground with these traps, laying down an AoE. If you've never used a Sunblast before, I'd recommend buying one in Standard or Sanctum if you can, and giving it a try. I personally like the feel of the playstyle, but it's maybe not for everybody. Also, one other important note, and I've mentioned this in my other videos, but even though this note says, or this equipment says, traps cannot be triggered by enemies, we have a number of notables like Master Sapper and High Explosives, which grant you charges when it's triggered by an enemy. Now, you would think on a cursory glance that this would brick those two passives, but if you have skitter bots on, they will trigger the traps for you and they count as enemies for whatever reason, and you'll still be able to get those frenzy and power charges. Okay, let's talk about the transition to self-chill. Self-chill is basically managing a couple of things in tandem. So the first is your chaos res. You can't get by with -60 chaos res. I explained this in more detail in my other video, but basically you're going to do a self hit, which triggers Call of the Voids. All damage with hits can chill, and then you're going to reverse the effect of chill on yourself. So you're hitting yourself with Forbidden Right level 1, which does chaos damage to yourself, hence the chaos res that you need. And then that in turn is applying a positive 30 action speed instead of a negative 30 action speed. Now there's a couple other things that are important here. You'll note that my life regen is not 0. So chaos damage entirely bypasses your energy shield, so you need some amount of sustain in order to keep this up. The life regen comes from a couple different sources. So the first is Enduring Cry. Enduring Cry is going to generate almost 2,000 life over 1 second, and is the entire reason we use Call to Arms, to make it so that we don't stutter step when we invoke Enduring Cry. I keep it on left click, it procs every 8 seconds. And then you're going to have a few sources of life regen on the tree. So one is Rot Resistant, which I have on 3 passive clusters. This is sort of the easiest way to chaos res cap yourself, and then grab this new Protection Mastery wheel over here. These are generally very cheap at League Start, and you can just alt spam for rot resistant. That's all you need to do for these. And then the other part we get life regen from is our lethal pride. So I prioritize life regen. I think I have 1 or maybe 2% here, 2%. And you can use the find timeless jewel tool to do that, but this isn't strictly necessary. You can use any lethal pride. This just made it a little easier to keep my life topped up whenever I do self damage. Okay, next let's look at gear. Starting at the top, we have an alternating scepter. This is critical because Secrets of Suffering grants us Brittle and Scorched, both of which are huge. So Brittle helps us crit cap, and we need that. This is a really simple scepter at this budget level. Basically, all I did was I took a Veiled Chaos Orb and I hit it. You're going to get some other mods that are good. I picked Crit Multi, but it doesn't matter. You just need to unveil the 4-second trigger socketed spell when using a skill. I benchcraft spell damage here. You'll see my trap throwing speed. Normally you'd see trap throwing speed as a suffix on something like this. However, we have so much trap throwing speed that it actually made more sense to pick up a flat damage benchcraft. The next piece of gear, and this is the only expensive crafted piece of gear, is a +2 gems scepter. The only things that really matter are grabbing a useful fractured base. So this is a 95% increased spell damage, +2 gems, and then benchcraft trap throwing speed. This is actually really easy to craft. I know that it probably looks very fancy, but I created a video explaining how to go about doing this. You don't need to do the prefixes need to be changed and then Veiled Chaos Orb on this. Literally the +2 gems and a fractured spell base is going to be perfectly fine. And these bases are very cheap on League Start because lots of people are level 75 or 76 or 77 and doing maps and dropping fractured bases like this. The next thing is going to be a Hubris Circlet. You're going to want at least the lowest tier of mana reservation efficiency. You can roll something higher, but I needed at least the lowest one in order to give us a comfortable amount of mana left. And the Explosive Trap enchant. Any ES base helmet will work, and really any helmet will work at all, but the Hubris Circlet is the best, and any T1, T2, T3 ES base is going to be great. This is a Skin of the Lords Call to Arms. Not really clear how much this will cost in the opening weekend, but generally Call to Arms is a more desired Skin of the Lords, so I would keep an eye on this as far as budget-wise. You don't need this. You can run without Enduring Cry. It's just much more comfortable to have those 3 endurance charges and the extra life regen. The gloves are basic trash. Like the only thing that's interesting on these gloves are there's some increased life regen. Any roll of that is fine, but honestly, this is low enough that it doesn't even really matter. And the fizz converted to cold. Now, there are 2 ways you can do this. One is you can Veiled Chaos Orb and unveil 35% fizz damage converted to cold, and then roll a low tier of the implicit. That's perfectly fine. I do that because it's worth dropping these 5 points to get the fizz conversion. So if you are looking to shave a little bit more off this budget, I would path to these nodes. But otherwise, the gloves don't really matter. A nerve is really nice to have. It's like an extra 10% spell damage. But again, like there are ways that you can reduce costs as you're scaling up. That's probably the first thing I would do. This is a pretty basic set of boots, like 25% movement speed. Basically, you're just looking for the Cannot Be Frozen so that you can take this nice Soul of Lunaris, which grants us an additional 6% LE damage reduction. This is a really basic amulet. It's a +1 gems amulet with this 20 roll of strength. I think was enough to put me over the strength cap. But you could get something certainly much fancier here. Call the Void is going to be a wild card on opening weekend. It was 2 div on day 1 last league, and then it dropped to I don't know 100C or something like that the second day. And then further on the 3rd day. So this is a little bit variable. It sort of depends on how fast you get to this red maps transition into self chill. But most people are going to be, even if you're pushing it, maybe day 2 or day 3, and this will be reasonably cheap. Winter Weave, pretty common drop, generally fairly cheap. maybe 10C or 15C, sort of depends. Sunblast is a bit of a wild card. You want a nice roll on this, as high a roll as you can, as close to 75% trap reduction as you can. Anything like halfway or higher, I personally would wear. I think my first Sunblast in 319 was a 63% reduced trap duration, and it felt totally fine. But again, this is like exiting maps, and then you're coming into endgame. One thing to do is, if you're looking for a better roll, is buy a bunch of really trashy rolls, like 50% reduced trap durations. I bought several of those for 2 and 3C, and then did the vendor recipe to try and get a 75% trap duration, and that worked perfectly fine. Okay, next let's look at Flasks. So this is a life flask with instant recovery and bleed immunity. Really the only important part is bleed immunity. You need that somewhere in one of your flasks. The second, and this is a really important part of additional damage layer, is a flask. It doesn't have to be a sulfur flask, but I chose sulfur flask because it's a 12% extra damage. And it needs to have increased effect, the increased effect enchant, which are generally pretty easy to roll. I think it's like 1 in 5 or 1 in 6 in kindling orbs. And then crafted some percentage reduced mana cost of skills. It doesn't have to be 25, but it needs to be enough that you can reduce your divine blessing into something that is castable. So right now I've got haste, inspiration, zealotry, and divine blessing all linked in my boots. And divine blessing, you can sort of throttle it. You can reduce the mana cost down to 279 here by getting a lower level one. But for what we're doing here, this is fine. High level one is fine. But this flask, when you pop it, will make the mana cost for haste and zealotry 0, which will allow you to cast it. And these spells, haste and zealotry, last for 9 seconds. So zealotry is a pretty fat DPS boost, 30%, and then haste is amazing for leap slam. Haste allows you to just absolutely rip through maps. Highly recommend that. The next is a diamond, a jade, and a granite. You can mix these up if you want. I found these to be the best for me. And then the suffixes, really, you can do whatever you want, but you need crit chance in order to, or I guess make sure that your PoB covers crit chance. You want to be all the way capped, and this is an easy way to do it. And the last important flask you need is ignite immunity. So since we're not a Sabo, we don't get free ignite immunity, and ignite sucks. So what I've done here is enchanted this with use when you become ignited, and then ignite immunity. That's really important because if you're just dying out to ignite, it just feels absolutely terrible. Okay, next let's talk about the clusters and jewels. We use one small cluster here, another small cluster here, medium here, large here, and another small here, and then a handful of jewels. These are all pretty easy to roll. So the medium cluster, the only important node on here is guerrilla tactics. The two small clusters, these are identical in the PoB, but basically what you need to do is buy a 3 passive chaos res. This is the cheap way to chaos cap ourselves. Again, we need this for self chill. We need a high roll of chaos res. And then you're going to alt spam for rot resistant. Rot resistant helps us with our life regen and also provides a good amount of flat chaos res. I used 2 of them here. Again, as your gear changes, you might need less. I think I ended up not needing one in my very, very endgame PoB because I was getting it from other sources, but this is a really cheap way to do this, and I recommend starting this way. This is an 8 passive fizz cluster. It doesn't need to be these 3 passives. In fact, the passives don't really matter, only that you don't allocate master the fundamentals, because this will reduce your elemental damage. Any set of these is fine. If you need a 9 passive, also fine. Doesn't really matter too much. Again, this is, Ironbreaker grants us around 6% DPS. Furious Assault grants us 4%. I would totally take the one that grants extra evasion and armor that I can't remember off the top of my head right now, instead of either of those 2. This is just the first one that I found for quite cheap. You can craft these large clusters, just get a reasonable eye level, something I think above 50, get an 8 passive cluster. These will generally be pretty readily available on League Start, and then get 1 socket fossil resonators and roll them with the fizz fossil. And then you're going to want to buy an any eye level 3 passive mana reservation efficiency cluster. Again, these are generally very cheap on League Start, but you'll need it in order to give yourself enough mana headroom to make casting everything that you need to comfortable. Here I'm using a reduction of mana cost skills gem. The rest of the stuff doesn't matter. I used it for, this happens to have lightning and cold res on it, fire res on it. Doesn't matter. The important one is reduced mana cost. You want to have your mana cost for explosive trap be ideally, I think, below 10. It's gonna matter. It's gonna depend on how much unreserved mana you have, but being able to socket one or more of these mana cost gems is a good way to help manage this. Also worth mentioning, and I don't think I said it earlier, but in the gear video, but in boots, the enchant is a mana cost skills if you've been hit recently. This is what makes this whole thing work for us. So if we take these boots off, mana cost goes up to 19. With the boots on, it goes down to 8 because we're constantly self-hitting with Forbidden Right. You need this enchant. I know that the 120% crit chance is very strong, but I think this is generally better. All right, one of the questions I've gotten the most is why Trickster? And the answer is we have so much damage that it makes sense to start speccing into other things. One, Assassin is very strong damage-wise. You can see Opportunistic grants some, it's a conditional damage reduction, but 25% more damage when there is Rare Unique is an amazing bossing node. It's probably the best one in the game. Ambush and Assassinate, these are, and I'll do a video on this later, but this is the Forbidden Flame and Flesh I would recommend swapping into. This is an incredibly strong node and allows you to crit cap and do additional damage on low life and full life, and then grants culling. So this ends up being just an amazing node, but we can get it on Trickster through Forbidden Flame and Flesh. And the other nodes are kind of meh. You know, Deadly Infusion doesn't really matter anymore once you're crit capped. I mean, getting that 1.5% base crits chance is nice. This also doesn't really matter. Unstable Infusion is, you know, roughly the same as high explosives. I mean, you get some extra chance and an extra power charge, but that's sort of a non-issue. And then importantly, the small nodes, the travel nodes in the Ascendancy, they're extra crit chance, which again is nice, but we're already crit capped, so it doesn't really do anything for us. On Trickster, the small nodes grant movement speed, energy shield, and evasion rating, all of which are infinitely helpful, like meaning that the cap for them is you're not going to reach a cap. And then the nodes on Trickster itself are amazing defensively. So Spellbreaker is completely broken. It basically nullifies half of hits that are suppressed. The fact that Energy Shield recharge starts immediately is incredible. It gives you a flat 20% chance to suppress spell damage. You'll see in my gear, I have literally 0 rolls of suppression. It all comes from the tree, and we're 102%. It all comes from the tree and these nodes. Escape Artist is kind of, you know, it's extra ES and it's extra evasion, but it's not a huge deal. Polymath is amazing. Right now, I don't have as many masteries as I would in a full level 100 one, but I expect this would be, you know, 20+% additional more damage. And then Heartstopper, I absolutely love. So 40% less damage from hits for 5 seconds is, and I know it's conditional, but man, 40% is a lot of damage. And then when it's not on, you still get 40% dot reduction. So this is a huge defensive layer, and I absolutely love it. And as far as Saboteur, the identity of the Ascendancy feels like it's changed. So Perfect Crime used to be a really fantastic, and the Forbidden Flame and Flesh I'd recommend for this build, but it's been changed to do these trigger bots. Now trigger bots look really cool, but they're not helpful for this build. Probably what I would get is Explosives Expert, and then add Infernal Legion to skitter bots to cause, so that you could benefit from all of these. I would take Pyromaniac because immunity to Ignite and Shock is amazing. And then Born in the Shadows because Blind is also very nice. But again, like, it doesn't have the same defensive utility as the Trickster Ascendancy. And so that's why I think Trickster is the best choice here. Speccing into a bunch of Energy Shield, you know, like 1500 or more, allows you to take full advantage of things like Ghost Dance. So if you've watched my other videos on this build, you'll know that getting mana cost down to something reasonable is important and also somewhat tricky to do. I have the skill cost around 8 right now and 105 unreserved mana. I think this is way more headroom than I need, but this was a pretty good start for a simple transition into self-chill endgame. The way that I achieve that is with a boot enchant, 18% reduced mana cost of skills. We've been hit recently. We've always been hit recently thanks to Forbidden Right, so this is always up. I'm also using one jewel with 5% reduced mana cost of skills. You can sort of modulate and swap out things if you need to, or maybe allocate, another large cluster instead of a small cluster in one of these. Let's see, this upper one here, so that you can socket additional jewels. That's fine. Or there's another spot on the tree I think you could use here for jewel. Those I found to be pretty helpful. And then the other thing is the skill itself. So I've linked explosive trap with an anomalous trap and mind damage, which reduces the cost of the skill by 10%, and then also a divergent inspiration instead of a normal inspiration. So divergent is an additional 10% on top of that. These at leak start generally are like 100 C, and the anomalous trap and mind damage at leak start are maybe 20 or 30 C. Obviously every league is different, but that's why I waited and I put together the league start version of the build, crit all the way into red maps using the non-self chill, and then you'll have to find a few extra div in order to support paying the extra cost for these special gems in order to manage the mana cost. All right, I think that's everything I wanted to cover for the league start version of this video. There are some other videos with crafting higher tiers of gear. Once you start making 10 div scepters, then you start insta-phasing Ubers. You'll find those videos also on this channel. And then another more in-depth build guide for pushing this into endgame. This is primarily focused on league start and how to start the build on the beach and then push all the way into campaign, out of the campaign and into maps, and then out of maps and into the endgame content with bosses or invitation farming. Feel free to shoot me any questions you might have. POBs are in the description, and happy 321.